I recently had a conversation with young Earth creationist Cordova about genetic entropy. This video was going to be streamed live, but it didn't actually work out, the streaming part, because the audio quality was not so great. So I decided to take the video, chop it down a bit, and I'm going to break this down into several different parts. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about creationist genetics today. And this is also an opportunity for me to practice my Adobe Premiere Pro skills. So we're going to take it from the part where Sal describes a little bit of creationist genetics. So let's get started.
Indirectly.
So I'm kind of curious how genetic entropy fits into like the bigger creationist model, right? So if the Earth is 6,000 years old and humanity is 6,000 years old, I suppose that means that if we have this steady accumulation of mutations that Sanford seems to highlight, well, then, and it's only going to accumulate more and more, is basically the model that and you've stated multiple times that humanity is declining, that we have, you cited a few different lines of evidence, like, I don't know, did you say something about decline in IQ, or that our brains are smaller than they used to be, which is true, right? There's some evidence that that's the case. When you look in the fossil record, there does appear to be a decline in brain size in humans on the order of around 10%, although some of that data has recently been challenged. But I still think that some of that is compelling. But you're saying that those are evidences of this decay, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So we had Adam and Eve, and all humanity is descended from Adam and Eve. But then, of course, we had another bottleneck with the flood, where Noah and his descendants were the second bottleneck. That was around 4,000 years ago or so. So I wanted to interject a little just to clarify what I'm trying to say. We have all of humanity descending from Adam and Eve, right? They were in the Garden of Eden. They had some kids, Cain and Abel. We all know Cain and Abel were the famous story of Cain killing Abel, and so obviously Abel had no kids. Adam and Eve also had another son named Seth, and all of humanity is descended from Seth. And that's because Seth's lineage leads to Noah. So let's go down that lineage a little bit. We have, a number of people described in the Bible, such as Methuselah. So here's a picture of Methuselah. This is a stained glass image from someplace, probably in Europe. I don't know. Anyway, so Methuselah, what he's famous for is being the oldest person described in the Bible. He was 969 years old. And so, he was also Noah's grandfather, which is pretty cool. And of course, I say we have a second bottleneck because there was the great flood. God decided to kill all of humanity. He felt that they were not obeying his laws, so therefore everyone had to be killed. Noah and his family were the sole survivors. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They had wives, and Noah, of course, had his wife, and all 8 of them were the only people that survived the Great Flood 4,000 years ago, according to creationists. Therefore, that means all of humanity is descended from these 3 people, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then their wives. So we have another bottleneck, another genetic bottleneck. We only have so much genetic variability that we could derive from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so presumably genetic entropy means that that's part of why we have the variability that we have today. Where Noah and his descendants were the second bottleneck. That was around 4,000 years ago or so.
I actually don't know. I'm not really anal as like other creationists about timelines and chronology.
It's critical, isn't it? Because like if there's a rate of mutation, because like the way we develop phylogenetics is that there's kind of an assumed rate of mutation, and that mutations steadily accumulate, because that's part of what we're talking about, right? Mutations accumulate in the genome, and we can use that rate of mutation to make inferences of when there was a last common ancestor between different species.
I think one reason I'm not that anal is we do know that there are hotspots in the genome, and there's variability within the mutation rates.
Right. There's some there's generally going to be mutations that we can observe when you compare closely related species, for instance. I mean, there's just a general rate of mutation based on generation time that we can observe, right? And because what's passed between generations is the genes. And so if a given species has a generation time of 1 year, well, then like the rate that mutations accumulate is going to be faster than it is in humans, which is on the order of 25 years or so, right?
If I'm sorry to interrupt it,
Yeah.
there has been concern that the molecular clocks may actually even be different for different ethnicities.
I haven't heard that.
And that this is a testable prediction being made by creationists, but we've observed it.
So you're saying the rate of mutation may differ between
I'll tell you why. Because the DNA repair mechanisms, if those genes are knocked out in one lineage, the mutation rate is going to be higher.
Sure.
Yeah. And so that's
are there human beings that have no DNA repair?
It may be compromised in that, and I'm just saying that's within the realm of possibility for any lineage of creatures, not just human beings, that if there's compromise in their DNA repair mechanisms, they may have higher mutation rates. Now, we also do know in bacteria, under stress conditions, they can actually accelerate their mutation rates. It's kind of a last resort defense. So that's why I'm saying I'm not anal about trying to use those as clocks. It might generally say that we might have kind of bigger error bars. Right. So we'll have a mean and then a kind of really big error bar. But, to try to narrow it down within like a few thousand years, I'm like,
right. If the model is that the Earth is only 6,000 years old and there was Adam and Eve at the start. So actually, I'd kind of like to talk about that a little bit. So sure. Eve was made from Adam's rib, is what you believe, right?
Yes.
Creationists believe that Eve was created from Adam's rib. This is a fresco depicting this biological, technological event. The guy on the left, I presume that that's God. I don't know. He kind of looks like Jesus, but I guess this is God. I also don't understand why he's missing a finger, but okay. But anyway, what the point is that this is illustrating how Eve just sort of sprang forth from Adam's rib. This is what creationists believe, that Eve was formed and fashioned out of Adam's rib. They don't go into the details of how this occurred, but obviously draws up a bunch of different questions. If you have just one rib, how do you make a whole person from that one rib? Also, the other thing is that, of course, is that a man, Adam is a man. Presumably, he has 23 pairs of chromosomes, including an XY chromosome set. And then you have the rib that then has male tissue, male chromosomes, but this is then turned into a female, which has XX. I suppose the fact that Adam has XY, that I guess what would have happened is that if this is Jesus here, Jesus, sat down and made sure that every cell had a duplicated X chromosome. But what we're going to hear from Sal is an explanation of how we get heterogeneity in the chromosomes. Because if you're starting with just 2 sets of chromosomes, where does all the variability come from? How did that work? Because, I guess Adam, he had an X and a Y chromosome, and then Eve would have XX. What was the process in generating a female to emerge out of his rib? Do you have any sense of what the mechanical process was of that?
I think it's something outside of will be forever outside of our accessibility of physics and chemistry.
Why? Why do you say that? Because we could potentially do those things, don't you think?
It was done in a day, at least if you kind of read it literally like I do. Okay. And so we could not clone it and grow it. And plus, where would is the word gestate? I'm not a developmental biologist. What happens to the embryo inside?
The embryo needs to gestate. That's right.
Okay. Yeah. That would take 9 months at least, or whatever. But this happened in a day.
Yeah, maybe those details weren't necessarily included.
So I would
say, you're saying that was. I'm just kind of confused because it's like Is that a physical mechanism or is this non-physical?
Not non-physical and
So
not feasible.
so in a physical world, we had this non-physical event occur where Adam's rib was plucked from his body and was
Mhm.
converted into a whole female human being.
Right. And it would be a lesser process than creating a whole human being all at once. And so
Because I guess you're starting with some biological material.
or no, Adam was created from dust. From
Right.
it's
Yeah, that's right.
basically
That's
non-living
also.
matter assembled into there. And
But then Eve sprang forth from his
right.
rib, right? And
So
so then obviously the designer in this case made the decision of like, okay, well, what I'll do is I'm going to replicate the X chromosome so that you have two of them, right? Because we know that
well,
women have two X chromosomes.
well, there
And but
would
then I guess that does that mean
have
that
to
the
add some. He would have to add some extra things like dosage compensation for the X because the X chromosome in women is actually suppressed. One of them.
sure, right? There are mechanisms of dosage compensation.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, some genes are generally expressed in both chromosomes, and you get more or less equal amount, and then that also leads to some of the differences between you know female biology and male biology that you only get
Right.
half of the expression from in men versus women. But I guess then does that mean the other 22 chromosomes were identical
I,
to Adam?
the creationist model is no.
So
That
how are those
there was
changed?
created heterozygosity. That's the current model being promoted by Dr. Sanford, Nathaniel Jeanson, Rob Carter. We
So
don't know that it's right.
there was this duplication of the X chromosomes,
But then addition of
and
allele.
then the other chromosomes were also modified by the designer at that point
Yes, that's the
to
current
introduce
model.
heterozygosity. So okay,
Created,
so then
you'll
with
hear
those
that.
two individuals, we have four chromosomes for every pair of chromosomes that we have, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
So
And
you
that
have
was
four
six
sets
thousand
of
years
alleles.
ago. And so then
Yeah.
every other variation that we've had since then has to be derived from those four chromosomes that were originally set about by the creator.
No, there's definitely mutational stuff that's added, and
Who did that?
that's natural. We predict that that's natural. That's the
Oh,
That's the
okay.
prevailing
Right.
model.
Yes, that's what I mean.
By the
So
way,
then
I'm
you have
not
this
saying it's right,
right.
but people are putting out their models, and I'm not really involved in that. But
Hmm.
I have to be at least. I'm curious.
Let's review Sal's model here. Adam was fashioned from dust into a human being by God. At some point, God plucked Adam's rib from him, and the cells in this rib are filled with Adam's chromosomes, including the fact that each chromosome is represented by a single pair of chromosomes. Sal is saying that there were mutations that were added maybe at this point in order to have a certain number of alleles. But of course, God also had to turn this DNA into female DNA. So now we have a conversion happening where some of Adam's DNA is being converted over into female DNA. This, of course, includes the fact that he has to make an additional X chromosome. Remember, male chromosomes are going to be XY, and that 23rd pair now needs to be XX. So this rib is now converted over into female DNA, presumably. And at this point, now the rib can then be fashioned, converted, built, somehow poofed into a female. And that female is Eve, now Adam's partner and the grandmother of all of humanity. So this is the model, the creationist model, of how this genetics occurred. As you can see, this does involve, I suppose you might say, some faith statements, since this certainly seems to violate every understanding that we have of biological science. Sure.
So,
And then we had a bottleneck at Noah's flood, right?
right.
So 2,000 years passed, a lot of stuff happened, right? Earth became a cursed place, and God decided he was going to kill everyone. except for Noah's family. And then, so everyone was killed, everyone, right? Except for 8 people, I believe.
Yes.
And also 2 pairs of every animal or every species
There
or
was
kind,
like
right?
something about 7, and
Yeah,
I'm
right. Because
glad
the clean
you're starting.
animals, it was God said, hey, bring 7 of the clean ones.
Okay.
Right. And then only 7 pairs, and then only 1 pair of each other animal.
Right.
So that also would include, you believe dinosaurs were on the ark?
I don't know.
Have you given any thought to it?
I actually don't, because they're big. And
Okay, but so
so,
are elephants, right?
yeah, so
And
I'm
they
just like,
obviously were on the ark. We have them today.
yeah.
And
So,
God said, Noah, you have to take 2 of every animal, right?
see, there are a lot of passages in the Bible where, I think it could be subject to some interpretation. So what you're describing is kind of my personal belief,
Mhm.
which is we have things that we might not be able to verify scientifically. And so I do want to make a distinction between kind of like faith claims and maybe any sort of science that we might be able to shed a little light on how
To me, this
credible
seems
this
like,
is.
so what are we left with? Not a whole lot. It looks like most of Sal's descriptions of the genetic events around the origin of humanity, according to his model, as well as what happened around the events of Noah's flood, basically involves what he likes to refer to as faith statements. He also seems very, I would say, hesitant to want to really discuss these issues. So this conversation continued beyond this. I ended up going into a discussion about what we know about ancient genomes. And some of this is actually super interesting. I'm going to be following up with some additional videos on this, but I'm going to end this one right here. So if you like this kind of content, you want to see more of these discussions that I'm having with other scientists, so I've started that series as well as talking with people like Sal and me working through why their beliefs are, I would say, ludicrous. Please like this video, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching.